the most loved new God, the most loved new gods, a most loved new God, the most loved new goddess, the most loved new goddesses, a most loved new goddess, the most loved old God, the most loved old gods, a most loved old God, the most loved old goddess, the most loved old goddesses, a most loved old goddess, the most loved greater God, the most loved greater gods, a most loved greater God, the most loved greater goddess, the most loved greater goddesses, a most loved greater goddess, the most loved lesser God, the most loved lesser gods, a most loved lesser God, the most loved lesser goddess, the most loved lesser goddesses, a most loved lesser goddess, the most loved greater spirit, the most loved greater spirits, a most loved greater spirit, the most loved lesser spirit, the most loved lesser spirits, a most loved lesser spirit, the most loved major God, the most loved major gods, a most loved major God, the most loved major goddess, the most loved major goddesses, a most loved major goddess, the most loved minor God, the most loved minor gods, a most loved minor God, the most loved minor goddess, the most loved minor goddesses, a most loved minor goddess, the most loved superior God, the most loved superior gods, a most loved superior God, the most loved superior goddess, the most loved superior goddesses, a most loved superior goddess, the most loved inferior God, the most loved inferior gods, a most loved inferior God, the most loved inferior goddess, the most loved inferior goddesses, a most loved inferior goddess, the most loved ancestor God, the most loved ancestor gods, a most loved ancestor God, the most loved ancestor goddess, the most loved ancestor goddesses, a most loved ancestor goddess, the most loved descendant God, the most loved descendant gods, a most loved descendant God, the most loved descendant goddess, the most loved descendant goddesses, a most loved descendant goddess, the most loved descendant God, the most loved descendant gods, a most loved descendant God, the most loved descendant goddess, the most loved descendant goddesses, a most loved descendant goddess, the most loved transcendent God, the most loved transcendent gods, a most loved transcendent God, the most loved transcendent goddess, the most loved transcendent goddesses, a most loved transcendent goddess, the most loved future God, the most loved future gods, a most loved future God, the most loved future goddess, the most loved future goddesses, a most loved future goddess, the most loved present God, the most loved present gods, a most loved present God, the most loved present goddess, the most loved present goddesses, a most loved present goddess, the most loved past God, the most loved past gods, a most loved past God, the most loved past goddess, the most loved past goddesses, a most loved past goddess, the most loved God, the most loved gods, a most loved God, the most loved goddess, the most loved goddesses, a most loved goddess, the most loved half God, the most loved half gods, a most loved half God, the most loved half goddess, the most loved half goddesses, a most loved half goddess, the most loved vessel, the most loved vessels, a most loved vessel, the most loved person, the most loved persons, a most loved person, the most loved image, the most loved images, a most loved image, the most loved belief, the most loved beliefs, a most loved belief, the most loved thought, the most loved thoughts, a most loved thought, the most loved word, the most loved words, a most loved word, the most loved action, the most loved actions, a most loved action, the most loved situation, the most loved situations, a most loved situation, the most loved circumstance, the most loved circumstances, a most loved circumstance, the most loved relationship, the most loved relationships, a most loved relationship, the most loved number, the most loved numbers, a most loved number, the most loved formula, the most loved formulas, a most loved formula, the most loved symbol, the most loved symbols, a most loved symbol, the most loved color, the most loved colors, a most loved color, the most loved thing, the most loved things, a most loved thing, the most loved way, the most loved ways, a most loved way, the most loved place, the most loved places, a most loved place, the most loved time, the most loved times, a most loved time, the most loved event, the most loved events, a most loved event, the most loved result, the most loved results, a most loved result,